The hall shimmered that night. Chandeliers cast golden light across the crystal glasses and polished silverware, their reflections dancing on the walls like echoes of celebration. Guests clinked flutes of champagne, laughter rising in waves that seemed to lift the very air. At the center of it all stood Gerald Whitmore, tall and silver-haired, the man of the hour. His career had spanned 5 decades, his reputation cemented in boardrooms and business journals. Tonight was his retirement party, a farewell to duty, a welcome to freedom. Beside him, poised and graceful despite the years, stood Frances Whitmore. 72, elegant in a navy silk dress that softened the lines of her figure, she carried herself with quiet dignity. She had spent days planning every detail of this evening, the floral arrangements that lined the tables, the carefully curated menu, even the playlist of Gerald's favorite old jazz numbers. This was meant to be a tribute, not just to him, but to the life they had built together. Yet as she smiled at guests and accepted congratulations on Gerald's behalf, a faint unease prickled at the edges of her heart. Something in the way Gerald's eyes flickered, not toward her, but toward the far side of the room. Frances followed his gaze. There near the buffet table stood Isabelle Cruz, their housekeeper. 38, dark hair tied neatly at the nape of her neck, she wore a modest black dress that fit her figure with understated elegance. To most in attendance, Isabelle was invisible, just another staff member ensuring the evening ran smoothly. But Frances noticed the way Isabelle lingered near Gerald's line of sight, the way her lips curved in a smile meant for him alone. Frances's chest tightened. Perhaps she was imagining it. After all, Isabelle had been with them for nearly a decade, practically part of the family. Frances had always treated her with kindness, helped her find a good school for her son, offered her flexible hours, even lent her money once when her mother fell ill overseas. Isabelle had repaid that kindness with loyalty, or so Frances believed. But tonight, in the midst of Gerald's grand send-off, there was a flicker in Isabelle's eyes that unsettled her. "Frances," a guest exclaimed, breaking her thoughts, "you must be so proud. 50 years at the helm, what an achievement." She forced a smile, nodding politely. "Yes, it's been quite a journey." The man clapped her shoulder before drifting away. Frances turned back toward Gerald just in time to catch him leaning slightly toward Isabelle, whispering something quick, something low. She couldn't make out the words, only Isabelle's soft laugh that followed. The sound chilled Frances more than it should have. As Gerald moved toward the stage for his opening speech, Frances's mind replayed that laugh, that glance, that whisper. The pieces didn't quite fit, but the edges pressed painfully against her intuition. She clasped her hands together to steady them, trying to focus on the applause that greeted Gerald as he took the microphone. "My friends," Gerald began, his voice booming with practiced authority, "tonight is not an ending, but a beginning. After decades of hard work, I finally step into the freedom of retirement, and I couldn't have done it without the people in this room, colleagues, friends, family." His words flowed easily, honed from years of speeches, but Frances noticed something in his tone, an undercurrent of triumph that wasn't directed at the crowd. It was more personal, almost intimate. She scanned the audience. Isabelle stood near the doorway now, half-shadowed, her gaze fixed on Gerald. When he spoke of new chapters and fresh beginnings, Isabelle's eyes glistened, and she bit her lip in a way Frances had never seen before. The applause rose again, but in Frances's ears it was muffled. Her vision tunneled to that silent exchange, to the invisible thread tugging between her husband and the woman she had welcomed into their home. "Starting fresh," Gerald repeated, raising his glass. Frances's heart skipped. That was the phrase. She remembered. She had overheard him whispering those exact words earlier, his voice low, Isabelle's hand briefly brushing his arm. The clinking of glasses filled the hall. Frances lifted her own flute automatically, but the champagne burned on her tongue. Her smile remained fixed, but behind it, her thoughts swirled. Could it be? After all these years, after all their battles and reconciliations, after the children and the sacrifices and the decades of loyalty, could Gerald be planning to start a fresh life not with her, but with the woman who had dusted their shelves and folded their laundry? Frances's daughter Laura approached then. "Mom," she said softly, You look pale. Are you feeling all right? Frances blinked, startled, and forced herself to nod. I'm fine, darling. Just the excitement of the night. But inside, a storm was forming. She tucked away the unease, as she had done many times before, but this time the cracks were spreading too fast to ignore. As Gerald basked in the applause of his colleagues, Frances felt a cold truth pressing at her ribs. This celebration might not be the tribute she thought it was. It might be the stage for a betrayal about to break wide open. And if it was, she would not sit quietly. The applause faded as Gerald stepped down from the stage, beaming like a man untethered. Guests surrounded him, shaking hands, clapping his back, praising his unmatched career. Frances lingered near the edge of the crowd, her smile brittle, her fingers tightening around the stem of her glass until the crystal pressed sharp against her palm. To anyone else, the night sparkled with success. But to Frances, shadows lurked behind every glittering surface. In the weeks leading up to tonight, little things had unsettled her. Gerald had suddenly grown meticulous about his appearance. New suits, polished shoes, a cologne he hadn't worn in decades. He claimed it was for work, but he was months away from retirement. Why impress anyone now? Then there were the late evenings. He'd claimed he was closing projects, attending farewell dinners with colleagues. Yet Frances remembered finding receipts in his pockets. Dinners for two, not for one. A hotel reservation in a part of town where no office stood. Jewelry she had never received. She had wanted to believe the explanations. Oh, that was a colleague's wife's gift. Or, I stayed overnight after a late business meeting. For 50 years she had trusted him. Doubt had no place in their marriage, or so she told herself. But doubt had a way of creeping back in, disguised as a whisper, a glance, a laugh. Back in the banquet hall, Gerald stood proudly among his peers, while Isabelle moved discreetly through the room, topping up glasses and adjusting trays. To anyone else, she was just doing her job. But Frances noticed details, the way Isabelle's fingers lingered on Gerald's shoulder when she leaned in, the way his laughter warmed only when she passed by. Laura reappeared, her brow furrowed as she slid beside her mother. He barely mentioned you in that speech, she whispered, after everything you've done for him. Frances forced a smile. It doesn't matter. But it did. Her chest ached at how easily Gerald had glossed over her decades of sacrifice. No mention of the nights she'd raised the children alone while he traveled. No acknowledgement of the way she had supported his ambitions, managed their home, shielded him from burdens. To him, she was a footnote in his grand story. And yet, he had found time to single out Isabelle. When Gerald praised her dedication, the guests clapped politely, assuming he meant household loyalty. Frances knew better. That word had weight in his tone, a kind of intimacy that did not belong in public. Dinner was served. Guests laughed around the table, forks clinking against plates, champagne bubbling. Frances sat across from Gerald, her eyes drawn to him, even when she tried to look away. She watched his hand slide under the tablecloth, watched Isabelle's shoulder tremble with a stifled smile as she passed plates. Then she saw it, the unmistakable brush of fingers. Quick, subtle, but charged. Her blood ran cold. Frances stared at her plate, appetite gone. The roast beef blurred before her eyes, her fork heavy in her hand. Around her, conversation buzzed, oblivious. She alone saw the betrayal unfurling in real time. She remembered Isabelle's first day in their home, a nervous young woman, grateful for steady work. Frances had shown her where the linens were kept, had told her, "This house isn't just where you work. It's where you're safe," Isabelle had smiled then, eyes wide with gratitude. And now those same eyes looked at Gerald with a different kind of need. Frances excused herself from the table, moving toward the balcony. Cool air kissed her cheeks, but inside her heart burned. She clutched the railing, nails digging into her palms as she fought to steady her breath. Laura followed moments later. "Mom, talk to me." "What's happening?" Frances hesitated. How could she put it into words? That the man who once held her hand through childbirth, who stood beside her at funerals, who promised her the world, was slipping through her fingers, stolen by the very woman she had welcomed into their lives. "I'm fine," Frances whispered. "I just need a moment." Laura didn't look convinced. She rested a hand on her mother's shoulder, but when Frances turned back toward the hall, Isabelle was there again. This time she wasn't laughing. She was crying softly, Gerald's hand brushing her arm in a way no employer should. Frances's breath caught. It wasn't a suspicion anymore. It was truth, unveiled in a single gesture. She returned to the table, her expression serene, though her insides quaked. Gerald was oblivious, too wrapped in his own revelry to notice the storm rising in his wife's eyes. Isabelle avoided Frances's gaze, busying herself with plates, but guilt shimmered in the downward curve of her mouth. Frances's mind worked quickly now, piecing together every oddity of the past year. The missing money, the coldness in Gerald's voice, the jewelry that vanished without explanation. She saw it all clearly, like a puzzle snapping together. This wasn't just infidelity, it was betrayal woven into the fabric of her life. Betrayal from her husband and from the woman she had once treated like family. She lifted her glass once more, smiling faintly as Gerald leaned in to toast with a colleague. But this time, her smile wasn't brittle. It was sharp, cold, deliberate. Because Frances Whitmore knew something Gerald didn't. The party he believed was his grand celebration would soon become his greatest humiliation. The laughter inside the banquet hall swelled again, a tide of cheer that threatened to drown Frances's composure. She sat perfectly still at the long table, her hands folded on her lap, her posture regal. To anyone looking, she was the picture of poise. But inside, her heart was a drumbeat of dread, each thud echoing with memories she could no longer push aside. She remembered the early years with Gerald, how she had abandoned her own dreams of graduate school when he received his first major promotion, moving across the country to support his career. She had raised Laura and Michael mostly on her own, while Gerald traveled the world closing deals. Nights when the children were feverish, when bills stacked higher than her comfort allowed, Frances had borne it all. Gerald had always reassured her. "This is for us, Frances. For the future. One day we'll enjoy the rewards together." And she had believed him. Believed so completely that she ignored the loneliness, the exhaustion, even the faint rumors whispered by other wives at company dinners. "Gerald is so charming with the assistants," one had said once, half joking. Frances had smiled politely and tucked the comment away, never letting it fester. For decades she carried his name, his home, his children, his burdens. She thought it was partnership. Tonight she realized it had been servitude disguised as devotion. Her gaze drifted again to Isabelle. She remembered the day she hired her, a timid young woman, recently divorced, desperate for steady income to care for her son, Matteo. Frances had welcomed her with warmth. She had shown her the ropes, given her extra pay around holidays, even slipped her envelopes of cash when she knew Isabelle struggled with rent. Once, Frances had noticed Isabelle staring longingly at a pearl necklace in a catalog left open on the counter. A month later, Isabelle received a modest bonus with enough to buy it. Isabelle had wept with gratitude, kissing Frances's hand. Frances had smiled then, thinking she had secured loyalty through kindness. Now she understood. Kindness had been mistaken for weakness, because the necklace Isabelle wore tonight was not the one from the catalog. It was finer, expensive, unmistakably similar to one Gerald had once promised Frances for their 50th anniversary, a gift she never received. Other fragments surfaced, sharper now. A credit card bill that showed spa treatments Frances never booked. Hotel charges under Gerald's name, though he claimed he had been in Chicago on business. A silk scarf tucked into the laundry once. Too young, too bold for Frances's taste. She had asked Isabelle about it. Isabelle had shrugged, saying it belonged to a cousin. How blind she had been, or perhaps how determined to stay blind. At the table, Gerald leaned toward Isabelle as she poured his wine. His eyes lingered on her longer than propriety allowed. Frances saw the softening in his features, the subtle intimacy in his gaze, the kind of look he hadn't given her in years. Laura caught it too. She leaned close, her whisper hot against Frances's ear. "Mom, that's not normal." "Something's wrong." Frances only tightened her grip on her napkin, her knuckles white. She couldn't shatter her daughter's world just yet. Not here, not now. But the anger inside her was no longer just a spark. It was flame, gathering heat, hungry to consume. She looked around the room. Every face, smiling colleagues, beaming relatives, saw Gerald as a hero, a man who had built an empire, provided for his family, earned his triumph. None of them knew the truth, that the man they celebrated tonight had built his legacy on the back of his wife's silence and now sought to discard her for the woman polishing their silverware. It was not just infidelity, it was theft. Theft of decades of dignity, of trust. And Frances realized something else. She had suspected this for months, perhaps years. That was why she had started keeping the receipts, why she had quietly copied bank statements, why she had slipped jewelry boxes into her own drawer when she saw Isabelle handling them too casually. Part of her had known all along that a reckoning was coming. Tonight, she knew it would come here. Gerald rose for another toast, his smile wide, his glass high. He spoke of freedom, of finally being able to live honestly. The words caught Frances like a blade. Honestly? Was this his confession disguised as charm? Isabelle stood at the back of the hall, her hands folded, her eyes shining, not with servant's pride, but with a lover's anticipation. Frances recognized it now. She could feel the betrayal humming between them like an invisible current. Guests clapped, raising their glasses again. Frances raised hers too, her face serene, though her hand trembled slightly. But inside, her thoughts were sharp, clear, cold. If Gerald wanted freedom, she would give it to him, but not in the way he expected. Tonight would not end with his triumph. It would end with his unraveling. As Gerald took his seat, basking in the glow of admiration, Frances's gaze lingered on him one last time. She felt no love in that moment, only clarity. The man beside her was not her partner, not her protector. He was a liar, a thief of her years, and a fool for thinking she would endure humiliation silently. She smoothed her napkin across her lap, her heart steady now. She had the truth, and soon everyone else would too. And when it came, it would not be quiet. The room buzzed with the heady glow of wine and nostalgia. Gerald had returned to his seat at the head of the table, flushed with pride, surrounded by old colleagues eager to bask in his success. Laughter echoed, forks clinked against china, and waiters carried in dessert trays balanced like offerings. To the untrained eye, everything shimmered with perfection. To Frances, the perfection had cracks so wide she could feel the cold air seeping through them. When Gerald rose again, glass in hand, Frances's stomach tightened. She had spent her life memorizing his cadences, his rhythms, his gestures. She knew this wasn't just another toast. His voice carried a current of liberation, and the words he chose were not random. "Tonight," he began, his tone booming, "marks not only the close of my career, but the beginning of a new life. A life unburdened. A life where I can finally be true to myself, live without the weight of responsibility." The guests chuckled warmly, assuming he meant golf courses and fishing trips. Frances, however, heard the razor edge beneath the charm. This wasn't about leisure. This was about shedding something, or someone. Her chest constricted as his gaze flicked, just briefly, toward Isabelle. And then came the knife. "There are people," Gerald said, "who've been by my side in ways few will ever understand. Their dedication has carried me through long nights, difficult decisions. To them, I owe more than words can ever repay." Isabelle's eyes glistened across the room. Frances's hand went cold around her glass. Not a word for her sacrifices, her decades of loyalty, her endless patience. Not one acknowledgement that she had raised their children while he built his empire. Instead, his gratitude flowed toward the housekeeper she had welcomed into their home. Laura leaned close, her voice a sharp whisper. "Mom, he's talking about her." "He's talking about Isabelle." Frances didn't reply. Her silence was louder than words. The guests clapped politely again, raising their glasses. Gerald smiled, basking in the spotlight, but when his eyes swept the room, they lingered too long on Isabelle. It was not admiration. It was not gratitude. It was intimacy, naked and undisguised. Frances caught it. So did Laura. So did two of Gerald's former colleagues, who exchanged awkward glances but quickly looked away. And in that moment, Frances felt something shift inside her. It wasn't grief. Not anymore. She had already mourned the loss of the man she thought she married. What filled her chest now was something steadier, colder, a resolve that had been building for months, maybe years, and was now ready to ignite. Frances placed her glass gently on the table, her fork beside it. Slowly she stood. The room quieted almost instantly, as if everyone sensed the shift in the air. Gerald turned, confused, his glass halfway raised. "Frances?" he asked, forcing a laugh. "You'll have to forgive her. She's always been the quiet one." The guest chuckled nervously, uncertain, but Frances did not smile. Her voice, when it came, was calm, even, so calm it sliced through the room sharper than a shout. "Gerald, do you want to tell them who Isabelle really is to you?" A ripple of gas broke across the hall. Forks clattered against plates. Chairs creaked as guests leaned forward, eyes wide. Isabelle froze where she stood, her tray trembling in her hands. Gerald laughed again, but the sound rang hollow. "Frances," he said, his voice tightening, "this isn't the time for one of your little scenes." Frances tilted her head, her eyes never leaving his. "Oh, it's exactly the time. Because if tonight is about honesty, then let's be honest." All eyes swung toward Isabelle, who stood pale and rigid. The tray in her hands shook until a glass tipped, shattering against the floor. Frances stepped forward, her heels clicking against the polished wood, the sound unnervingly steady. "You think I haven't seen it?" The gifts, the late nights, the hotel reservations under false names, the necklace around her throat, the one you promised me on our anniversary. How long did you think you could hide it, Gerald? Whispers spread like wildfire. A guest gasped audibly. One of Gerald's colleagues muttered, "Good God!" Gerald's face darkened. "You're humiliating yourself." Frances's lips curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. "Smile. No, Gerald." "I'm unveiling you." Laura stood, her chair scraping back sharply. She moved beside her mother, her hand steady on Frances's arm. "I knew it," she hissed toward her father. "I knew something was wrong." Her presence gave Frances strength, a wall of support she hadn't realized she needed. Together they faced Gerald, who suddenly looked smaller beneath the scrutiny of his peers. Isabelle tried to step backward, but Frances's voice halted her. "Don't move. You don't walk away from this. Not tonight." The once celebratory room had shifted. Where laughter had filled the air, now there was only the sound of whispers and shattered illusions. Gerald's colleagues avoided his gaze, some exchanging looks of pity for Frances, others of disgust for him. The music had stopped. The candles flickered strangely, as if even the flames were waiting. And Frances stood tall, her hand resting lightly on her daughter's, her gaze steady on the man she had once loved. She had played her role for decades. Loyal wife, silent partner, patient mother. Tonight she stepped into a new role, the one who ended the masquerade, and the night was far from over. The banquet hall was no longer a place of celebration. The clinking of glasses and hum of conversation had dissolved into a stunned hush. All eyes fixed on Frances, who stood tall, her chin lifted, her gaze cutting through Gerald like a blade. Gerald tried to laugh, to wave it off. "Come now, Frances. This is absurd. She's the help. Nothing more." His hand gestured dismissively toward Isabelle, who stood trembling near the doorway, her knuckles white around the tray she clutched like a shield. But Frances didn't flinch. Her voice rang clear, steady, and unshakable. "Then why?" she asked, her eyes narrowing. "Do I have receipts for the hotels you booked under her maiden name? Why did I find jewelry boxes hidden in your study? Why is the necklace she wears tonight the same one you promised me 15 years ago? Our 50th anniversary gift that never appeared." A gasp rippled through the room. Someone muttered, "Oh my God." Another whispered, "Unbelievable." Frances reached into her clutch and withdrew a small envelope. She had not planned to use it tonight, not unless the moment demanded it. But now, with Gerald cornered and the crowd waiting, it felt inevitable. She held up the contents for all to see. Photocopies of credit card statements, receipts for luxury dinners and overnight stays, even a photo of a diamond bracelet she had never worn. "I collected these for months," Frances said evenly, "because I knew the man I trusted was lying to me. and tonight I no longer have to keep his secrets. Gerald's face drained of color. The mask he wore so effortlessly in boardrooms and negotiations cracked. His mouth opened, but no words came. The silence in the hall thickened. His colleagues, the very men who had admired him for decades, shifted, uncomfortably. Their wives whispered behind their hands, their eyes darting toward Isabelle, who stood frozen in humiliation. "Mrs. Whitmore, please," Isabelle began, her voice trembling, but Frances cut her off with a sharp flick of her gaze. "Don't call me that. Not tonight. You don't get the privilege of respect after what you've done in my home, with my husband." Isabelle's lip trembled. She lowered her eyes as if hoping the ground would swallow her. Frances stepped closer, her heels striking the floor with deliberate force. "I took you in when you had nothing, Isabelle. I helped you when your son was sick. I paid your wages early when you couldn't make rent. And this," she gestured between Isabelle and Gerald, "is how you repay me." The shame on Isabelle's face was clear, but so was something else, a flicker of anger, of pride bruised by exposure. She opened her mouth, but Gerald's voice boomed before she could speak. "Enough!" Gerald roared, slamming his glass onto the table so hard it shattered. Guests jumped at the sound, some gasping, others recoiling. "You think you're clever, Frances? Airing our dirty laundry here, in front of everyone? You're making a fool of yourself. A bitter, jealous old woman clinging to scraps." His face was red now, veins bulging at his temple. Frances didn't flinch. Her eyes were cold steel. "No, Gerald. I'm showing them the fool you've become. You've humiliated yourself. I'm only holding up the mirror." His words faltered, drowned by the gasps and murmurs of the crowd. Laura stepped forward, her face pale but fierce. "Is this true, Dad?" "All of it." Gerald looked at her, his daughter, and tried to summon the same authority that once silenced boardrooms. But the weight of the evidence, the whispers, the stares, it crushed him. His mouth opened, then closed again. Laura's voice cracked, but it was strong enough to carry across the hall. "You betrayed Mom. You betrayed all of us." Tears burned Frances's eyes, but she didn't let them fall. Her daughter's words were enough. She was no longer standing alone. Around them, the guests shifted. Some turned their backs on Gerald, their admiration souring into disgust. A former colleague muttered, "I thought he was better than this." Another, shaking his head, whispered, "All that success, and he throws it away for this." The admiration Gerald had bathed in for decades evaporated, replaced by contempt. The man who once commanded respect now stood exposed, reduced, shamed. Frances held her ground, her voice steady. "You wanted to start fresh, Gerald? You whispered about freedom, about honesty. Then let's be clear. Your freedom will not be built on my silence. Not tonight. Not ever." Her gaze swept the room, catching the eyes of every guest, every witness. This was meant to be his celebration. Instead, it's the unveiling of who he truly is. And I will not let him hide behind charm and lies. Any longer, Gerald's lips trembled. He looked toward Isabelle, as if seeking refuge, but she turned her face away, shame and fear written across her features. For the first time in his life, Gerald Whitmore had no allies in the room. The room was dead silent, save for the faint sound of a champagne flute tipping over somewhere in the back. Frances straightened her shoulders, her hand brushing briefly against her daughter's for strength. Gerald opened his mouth once more, perhaps to defend himself, perhaps to beg. But no words came. The mighty voice that had commanded boardrooms faltered in the face of undeniable truth, and Frances, who had carried his weight for half a century, stood taller than him at last. The silence in the banquet hall was unbearable. It pressed against the guests, thick and suffocating, until every eye fixed on Gerald, waiting for an explanation that would never come. His face was a mask of anger and humiliation, red with fury yet pale with exposure. Frances, however, stood calm, her posture steady, her voice unshaken. She had not survived decades of sacrifice to crumble tonight. "Frances," Gerald growled, his words dripping with venom, "you think you've won something here? All you've done is embarrass yourself. You've destroyed this night. My colleagues, my friends, what will they remember? That my wife had a breakdown in public." He straightened, trying to reclaim his old authority, his voice carrying the same tone that had silenced men in boardrooms. I built this life, Francis. Without me, you'd have nothing. And now you make a fool of yourself, throwing tantrums like a child. But the words fell flat. The room wasn't his anymore. Francis's lips curved into the faintest smile, the kind that didn't reach her eyes. Without you, Gerald? Number. Without me, you wouldn't have survived long enough to stand here tonight. I raised the children, kept the home, covered the cracks you left behind. And while you built your empire, I was the one who held it together. Her tone hardened. You want to talk about power? Let's talk about the lawyers. Gerald blinked, caught off guard. Lawyers? Frances lifted her chin, her voice cool and deliberate. Yes, Gerald. Did you think I hadn't noticed the missing money? The accounts you shifted into places you thought I'd never look? The property you tried to transfer into another name? Gasps rippled through the room again. Gerald's colleagues glanced at one another nervously, some realizing they might be entangled in deals better left unseen. I spoke to attorneys months ago, Frances continued. Every hidden asset, every secret transaction, it's all documented. Do you know what they told me? That under the law, as your wife of 50 years, I'm entitled to half of everything. And after your little stunts with Isabelle, I may walk away with even more. Gerald's mouth opened, but nothing came out. He gripped the edge of the table, his knuckles white, his once commanding presence now crumbling under the weight of exposure. All eyes swung toward Isabelle. She trembled where she stood, shame burning her cheeks. She opened her mouth, perhaps to apologize, perhaps to plead, but Gerald snapped before she could. Shut up, he hissed, loud enough for everyone to hear. This is your fault. The words cut through the hall like a whip. Isabelle's shoulders collapsed, her tray slipping from her hands, glasses shattering on the floor. For years she had been his secret, his comfort, his prize. Now in the moment of truth, she was nothing more than a scapegoat. Frances didn't even look at her. Her voice remained steady, directed only at Gerald. You see? There is no loyalty in betrayal. Not from you, not from her, and not from anyone who watched me break my back for this family while you lived a double life. Laura stepped forward again, her eyes blazing. Mom, let's go. You don't owe him another second of your time. She turned to her father, her voice trembling with fury. You've destroyed everything you built. Not because of Mom, not because of Isabelle, because of you. Guests murmured in agreement. Heads nodded. Gerald, once admired, now stood isolated in a sea of contempt. Frances turned, her voice carrying across the hall. You thought this was your retirement party, Gerald. That this night was your crowning moment. But it's not. It's your resignation. From my life, from our marriage, from the pedestal you built on my silence. Her words sliced through the air, leaving no room for rebuttal. She reached for Laura's arm, steady and dignified. Together they moved toward the exit, their steps slow, deliberate. Guests parted like the sea before them, eyes following, whispers trailing behind. Some looked at Frances with pity, others with awe, but none looked at Gerald the same way again. Behind them, Gerald staggered, his hand gripping the table for balance. His colleagues avoided his gaze. The wives who once admired his charm now turned their shoulders. And Isabelle, humiliated and abandoned, crumpled into a chair, tears streaking her face. Gerald had dreamed of applause tonight, of ending his career with honor. Instead, he stood alone, his legacy shredded, his secrets unveiled. Frances didn't look back. As the heavy doors opened, cool night air spilled into the hall. Frances inhaled deeply, her chest lifting, her shoulders finally unburdened. She didn't smile, not yet. But there was strength in her step, a quiet certainty that she had reclaimed what mattered most, her dignity. Behind her, the room simmered with murmurs, Gerald's reputation in ashes. Ahead, the night stretched wide and endless, waiting. For the first time in decades, Frances felt free. The cool night air wrapped around Frances as she stepped through the tall doors of the banquet hall. Laura close beside her. The muffled roar of whispers and clinking glasses still echoed behind them, but Frances didn't turn back. Her heels clicked softly against the stone path. Each step steady, measured, final. Then, footsteps hurried after them. "Gerald!" Isabelle's voice cracked, desperate. She had followed him into the hallway, her hands wringing, her mascara streaked with tears. "Say something. Tell me it wasn't all for nothing. Tell me I wasn't just—" Her words collapsed into sobs. She reached for his arm, but Gerald yanked it away, his face twisted with fury. "This is your fault," he spat, his voice low but sharp enough to cut. "If you just kept quiet, if you hadn't been so obvious, none of this would have happened." Isabelle froze, her breath catching. For years, she had been his secret, his prize. Tonight, she was discarded like a broken glass on the banquet floor. Frances stopped, half turning just enough to witness the exchange. She saw the truth settle into Isabelle's face, the realization that Gerald had never planned a life with her, that all his whispered promises, all his starting fresh speeches, had been nothing but empty words. Isabelle's sobs turned into silence. Her shoulders slumped. She didn't chase him again. Gerald, red-faced and trembling, turned his glare toward Frances. "You think you've won? You think walking out makes you powerful?" His voice was ragged, desperate. "You'll come crawling back when you realize you can't live without me." Frances faced him fully now, her expression calm, almost serene. "No, Gerald. I already lived without you. For decades. I just didn't know it until tonight." Her words struck deeper than any scream could have. Gerald's mouth opened, but nothing came. The power he once held, over her, over the family, over every room he entered, was gone. Laura touched her mother's arm gently. "Let's go home, Mom." Frances nodded, her eyes never leaving Gerald's. She held his gaze one last time. Not with love, not even with hate, but with the quiet strength of someone who had finally stepped beyond his shadow. Then she turned, walking into the night with her daughter at her side. Behind them, Gerald stood stranded in the doorway, his mistress shamed, his guests whispering, his legacy crumbling. The great Gerald Whitmore, once celebrated, was now nothing more than a man exposed. And Frances? She didn't need applause. She didn't need revenge. She had her dignity back, and that was enough.
And that wraps up today's story. Now we want to hear from you. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments, and let's see how far these stories reach. If this story moved you or gave you chills, give it a like, share, and subscribe for more powerful stories. One last thing, rate the story from 1 to 10 in the comments. Your feedback helps us bring you even better ones next time. Thanks for watching. We appreciate you being part of this storytelling journey.